Welcome to the Investing Markets and Money podcast. And today we are talking about Africa and specifically the energy market in Africa. Joining us on the podcast, we have Ray Coyle from Energise Africa. Welcome, Ray.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Stuart.
So specifically, Energise Africa, can you give us a quick rundown of who you guys are and what you do?
Sure. So we're a platform, a UK-based platform, and it's a crowdfunding operation. And what that means is that we connect ordinary UK-based retail investors, ordinary people, to investment opportunities to provide debt funding to energy access companies in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay. And when we talk about African energy specifically, often you hear stories about people not having access to enough water, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa. Not so often do you hear about the energy issue as well. I know that some parts of Africa are growing very rapidly. There are some urban areas expanding rapidly as well. But where are the energy shortages occurring there?
Everywhere. There is one country in Africa, Gabon, that has more than 90% electricity access, which is the average for the rest of the world. Every other country in Sub-Saharan Africa has way less than that. And some have energy access levels down at 2 to 5%. There are 600 million people, that's 56% of the entire population of the continent of Africa, that do not have access to clean energy. And by clean energy, I mean either local solar power or access to a grid. In the vast majority of Sub-Saharan African countries, the electricity grid is very limited and restricted, maybe to a few urban areas. So the energy access in rural areas of Sub-Saharan Africa is very, very low. Most people therefore rely on diesel generators or simply don't have access to electricity. And the point that you make about water is a very, very interesting one, because there is a huge problem with access to clean water in Sub-Saharan Africa, and that problem is increasing because of climate change. The way to solve that is through access to energy, because pumping water up from boreholes and running water purification requires electricity. So solving the energy access problem is part of the solution to the access to water problem in Africa.
Understood. So when we're talking about clean energy here, basically, alternative energy sources for communities, businesses that are actually not connected to any kind of grid system at all.
Yes. Everything that we fund is renewable energy. And because it's Africa, and Africa's a pretty sunny place, it's generally speaking solar power. Africa has a huge proportion of the world's solar energy potential because of its geography, but only about 2% of the installed solar capacity in the world is on the continent of Africa, which makes no sense at all. So mostly what we're funding is solar power, either for individual homes or for communities and businesses. And that can take a few different forms. So at its simplest level, it could be just a solar home system, which might be one or two panels that go on the roof of somebody's home, a small battery, and then some power outlets. And the smallest scale ones will just power some lamps and maybe phone chargers. But they can run all the way up to having devices that can be plugged into them, such as refrigeration, televisions, depending on what people can afford. So that would be the kind of the entry level system. And then what we're increasingly seeing, and what we think is a really interesting development in Africa, are green mini grids. And a mini grid is a kind of small solar farm, if you like. Might be up to a megawatt, so maybe the size of a couple of football fields be the largest, and some are much smaller than that. And it would look like any solar farm that you might see in the UK at the side of a motorway or side of a train track, with the one difference being that in the UK, a solar installation like that is just plugged straight into the grid. Whereas a mini grid operates like its own little electricity grid. So as well as the solar panel, you would have a battery storage system, which would usually be in some shipping containers, and you would have the cabling directly from the green mini grid out to the small businesses that you mentioned, out to the households and the users of the electricity. And lots of fairly recently developed technology allows the operators of the grid to put smart meters in, like most people have in their homes in the UK. They can then be remotely monitored and people can pay for their electricity via their mobile phone. Phone banking is probably more advanced in lots of African countries than it is in Europe. So that's kind of the range of things that we're funding, from the small solar home systems up to mini grids that would serve an entire village or sometimes even a couple of villages.
So yeah, I was going to ask you about the actual scalability of this. It can be just on a village by village basis, so the whole village can get connected all together.
Yes, scalability is a very, very interesting area. When somebody wants to build, say, a solar farm in the UK, you know that you can sell the electricity to the grid. We have a national grid, we have a national market, there's a pricing structure for all of that. That doesn't exist in the areas in which the companies that we fund operate. And it's actually quite difficult to predict how much electricity a village that currently has no electricity will use. And it's difficult to predict what the demand level will be and when the demand will be. So often what developers do is they will build a grid at a relatively small scale to get it started and then expand it as people buy appliances to use electricity. Because when you switch on a grid, people aren't suddenly going to have the lamps, the fridges, the electric motorbikes, the electric sewing machines, milling machines, and all of that kind of thing in order to use the power. There'll be some immediate demand, because usually in a village there'll be a stinky, horrible diesel generator that can get turned off, to everybody's great relief. So there'll be the immediate demand from replacing that. But then as people get access to power, it gives them the opportunity to expand their businesses. So if somebody is running, say, a restaurant in a village, they have to shut when it gets dark if there's no electricity. When they have electricity, they can open for longer. That means they can bring in more customers. That means they can get more revenue in, which means they might want to expand their business, buy some more appliances, buy more refrigeration, and build on from there. So over time, the demand will increase. And the other thing that one of the interesting dynamics, particularly in rural locations, is that if a mini grid is installed in a village, the population of that village will increase because the economic activity of that village will increase, and it will become a more attractive place for people to move to and to live in. And then that increased population will further increase the demand for electricity. So it's very important to build in that expandability from the outset. And modern technology is very, very easy to expand. You can just literally put more racks and more solar panels on the ground, put some more inverters in, increase the battery capacity, and you've got more capacity in your mini grid. So it's very easy to do, and it's very important that there's that capability within the systems.
And can I ask you how you go about sourcing these projects? How do you locate them? How do you find the right partners to work with on this?
It's a good question. It's not easy. We raise all our money in the UK, so we're based in the UK, and Africa is a very big continent, and lots of these projects are very far away. So there's a number of different things that we can do. We work with a number of partners, ranging from very large. So the World Bank provides lots of funding for mini grids, so we work with the World Bank to co-fund alongside them, to local banks, to other investment funds, equity investors that pump money into these companies who then need some debt funding will introduce us to them. And there are networks that we belong to, the Alliance for Rural Electrification, the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, the African Mini-Grid Developers Association, that we work closely with in order to get connected to the companies that are developing the projects. But just being connected to them doesn't make them a good investment. So once we meet and we talk to these companies, we have a fairly rigorous due diligence process that we put companies through, which goes through various stages. We have a pre-qualification process initially to identify whether the company may be investable. And the vast majority of companies that we look at don't get through that phase. So we probably take hundreds of companies through pre-qualification in a year. And then once companies get through pre-qualification, we do due diligence on the company. And that's pretty extensive. So we need to do legal due diligence. I'm a lawyer by background. So we look at whether the company is properly incorporated, they own the assets they've got the legal rights to develop the project that they want to develop. Then we do commercial due diligence to look at what they've done in terms of the demand assessments and the community engagement to make sure that people will want the electricity and can afford to pay for the electricity that they're going to produce. And we do technical due diligence. And sometimes that will involve bringing in external partners and experts. And we've got some technical due diligence capability in-house to look at whether the plan for the construction is plausible and viable and can be done within the time frame. And if the product, and of course we do financial due diligence to make sure that all the numbers add up and to make sure that the company will be able to repay the debt when the project is completed. All of that takes time. So it can be anything from a couple of months to 6 or 8 months from when we begin that process to passing through the due diligence tests. Once we've done that, we will go and visit the site. So we go and we look at where the project is going to be developed. And pretty much all of the developers that we're working with at the moment have already developed mini grids in other sites or have been supplying solar home systems for a long time. So that gives us the opportunity to go to an existing site, to look at the installation, to look at the technology, to see how it's put together, to make sure it works, talk to the community, look at the finances for the projects that they've already done, and then we can go and look at the projects that they're about to build. So we've just, by way of example, we've just raised some funding for a couple of mini grids in Benin. And my colleague Fernando went out and he spent some time in the field in Benin. He looked at he went to a couple of villages where there were existing operating mini grids, and then he spent some time at the site that we're going to fund the development at. So it's really important to be there, to be on the ground, and it's also really important to meet the entrepreneurs. The vast majority of the companies we fund are African-owned, African-led, and it's really important that we meet their teams so that we can see how resilient and resourceful and experienced they are. These are complicated and sometimes difficult environments to work in. So one of the most important things for our investments is that we have the confidence that the team that we're relying on the ground will be able to overcome any challenges, geographical, logistics, weather challenges that arise as they try and build out the project. So that site visit aspect is really important for us.
And going on from there, I mean, we hear a lot about impact investment here at the Armchair Trader, but we've had a number of conversations with institutional investors about how do you measure impact investing? What is it? How do you measure it? How do you measure it on an ongoing basis? What do you do in that respect in terms of ongoing monitoring and reporting back to investors who want to feel that their money's working hard for them there?
We monitor the investments very closely. We get quarterly reports from all of the companies that have raised money on the Energise Africa platform. And we monitor the financial performance of the company, very importantly, to make sure that they are performing as expected and make sure that their finances are as expected in order to ensure that they'll be able to repay the debt when it falls due. But we also monitor very closely the impact that the company is having. And depending on the organization, that can be monitored in different ways. And it's quite important. Impact monitoring needs to be standardized, but it's not one size fits all. So for a company that's developing a mini grid, you can measure the impact in a number of different ways. So firstly, you can measure the CO2 savings. So if you know the number of megawatt hours that the mini grid has output and has been used by the people being served, then you can relatively easily calculate the CO2 offset. And there are accepted metrics for doing that, and it will vary quite a lot depending on the country. So in Benin, for example, a huge amount of the power that's generated is generated using diesel generators. So the CO2 saving from using solar power is very high. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, CO2 saving is actually much lower because the majority of power in DRC is hydro. So you've got to look closely at a number of different factors, including the geography. So we'll monitor the CO2 saving of the organisation. We'll also monitor the number of people that gain access to electricity. And the GOGLA, the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, has developed metrics and developed processes that we use for that. In order to work out the number of people who get access to lighting and electricity and over what period of time. So for a solar home system, for example, we assume a 3.5-year life for the system. We know that there are some that last much longer than that and are out in the field for 7, 10 years, but the industry standard is to measure the impact over a 3.5-year period. So that's what we do. Excuse me. And then the other thing that we can measure is the amount of power that people are using. We can't really do that in solar home systems because the data doesn't come back. But for mini grids, we know the amount of power that people are using if we're doing long-term funding for that mini grid. So there's a lot of different ways that the impact can be measured. And we're very fortunate in what we're funding in that the impact is incredibly clear. If people are getting access to clean, reliable solar power in rural areas of Sub-Saharan Africa where previously there was no grid connection, the impact is very, very clear. It's in our faces and it's very, very easy to measure. So I think we're in the fortunate position of having actually quite an easy job in identifying the impact that the funding has.
And now talking about investors, what sort of investors can get access to the platform, and what does it look like in terms of the investor experience?
Anybody over 18 can get access to the platform. We've really tried to make it very accessible. So that the platform, people need to register first on the platform. And there are a couple of checks that we need to do in order to do that. So we need to do KYC, know your customer checks. So people need to prove their identity. But that's actually a pretty easy process now with online databases and the ability to submit photographs of documents. So the process of registering and proving your identity to Energise Africa is pretty easy. Once people are registered on the site, we provide information on the different investment opportunities. So people can go in and they can look at different companies. And this is one of the most important differentiators for Energise Africa, is that we're not a fund. We don't take people's money and then decide what to do with it. We want to empower ordinary investors to go to a platform and to look at an opportunity to fund electric motorbikes in Kenya and look at an opportunity to fund mini grids in Benin or an opportunity to fund solar home systems in Congo and make their own choice as to where their money goes. So there's lots of information about the companies, the impact, and the opportunities for funding and information on what your money will be spent on. And then people choose where they want their money to go. And once you choose to invest, you get access to all of the legal documents, all the financial information on the company, everything that you need to make your investment decision. And then you can invest as little as £50. So we've deliberately kept the investment threshold really, really low because we want this to be for everyone. And once you've committed your money, you transfer. Everybody on Energise Africa has a wallet that they put money in order to invest, and then their repayments come back into their wallet. Interest or capital repayments come back into the wallet. And you invest your £50 or £50,000, whatever is right for you. And then you hold a bond in that company. And then you'll receive updates on how the company is progressing, on how the project that you're funding is progressing. And everybody can see, going back to your impact question, our platform will then calculate what the impact of your individual investment is. So if you've put £50 into funding a mini grid that's going to cost £50,000, then 0.1% of the impact of that entire mini grid will be attributed to your investment. So you will see, and updated on a monthly basis, the impact your investment has had, the number of kilos of CO2 that has been saved on a monthly basis, the number of people that get access to electricity, and the number of kilowatt hours of electricity that's been produced by your individual investment. And as you choose more investments and build a bit of a portfolio, those figures are aggregated, so you get your monthly update to see what your personal impact is. And you can also see on the platform what the overall impact of Energise Africa is, what the overall impact of a particular portfolio company is, and the overall impact of the bond that you participated in, so the 50,000. And then after you've invested and you get your updates, the company will repay. And the way the repayment works varies a little bit. So if we're funding solar home systems, the repayment period tends to be over a couple of years, and it will be repaid in stages. So the capital will come back, say 25% after 6 months, 25% after 12, 25% after 18, etc. And the reason for that is that the capital is used to buy the solar home system and then sell it to somebody on what's called a pay-go basis, because the customers typically can't afford to pay up front. So then as the customer pays off the solar home system, our investee then repays the bonds. For the mini grids, it tends to be a little bit different. We lend the money, and then once the grid is built, there's a refinancing, and our investors get paid in a single bullet repayment. And then that money comes back into the wallet, which investors can then withdraw or choose to reinvest. We've also tried to make it very easy for people to register for an innovative finance ISA, an IFISA, to enable people to invest on the platform tax-free. And the final thing that we've done is to introduce a guarantee for the first £100 people invest. So the first investment up to £100 is guaranteed. If for any reason the money doesn't come back or doesn't come back entirely, we will make up the shortfall. And again, the reason that we've done that is just to try and make this as accessible to as many people as we can, because we would much rather build a very large investor base than have a small investor base of a few institutions and companies. This is something that we want lots of people to be able to participate in, so that lots of people can put their money to good use and can see the impact that it can make in Africa.
And before we finished, could you just give us an example of a particular project that you guys have backed?
Yes. Altec is a good example of a project. We've been funding Altec for 4 or 5 years now, and they've grown wonderfully in that time, repaid every penny they've borrowed. They've been a great success story for us. Altec was founded by 2 guys from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it's based, and they met in a refugee camp and were funded by the United Nations to go to university in Tanzania from the refugee camp, where they went, and they studied business in the university there. And then they returned to DRC, and they set up Altec together. And they still run the business together, and they set it up to bring energy to their own community. And the reason that Altec has been so successful is that the 2 founders they know the country, they know the people, they know the communities, they know how to operate a business there. The company is headquartered in Goma, which I'm sure you've read about in the news recently. It was invaded by M23 rebels. It's been the center of conflicts multiple times. It's a very, very difficult area to run a business. And I couldn't run a business there, and the most successful entrepreneur you could find in the City of London couldn't run a business there. But local entrepreneurs who know the market, who know the communities, who know the country can run a business there. And they have everything they need to run the business. They have the entrepreneurial skills, the technology is there, they have the employees, they have a great team, they have the network. The one thing that they don't have is access to capital. It's very, very difficult to get access to capital in Africa. And that is what our investors can provide to them, is access to relatively inexpensive debt capital. And that has enabled them to grow this business. And they have provided solar home systems to hundreds of thousands of people in the Democratic Republic of Congo who now have access to electricity who did not previously. And that has enabled kids to study when they get home from school. It enables people to use milling machines instead of doing back-breaking labor for hours every day. It's enabled people to expand businesses, to set up businesses, to earn more money, and enables real economic growth. So for me, it's one of my favorite success stories. I could give you quite a lot of other ones, but we've probably run out of time. There are really, truly inspirational businesses that we fund.
And where can people go to find out more information about the platform and get involved?
Go to www.energiseafrica.com. We're pretty easy to find, and everything is there. There's a big button at the top that says invest, and that will take you through the process and set out all the different stages that you need to go through. As I say, we've tried to make it as easy and as straightforward as possible. It is investing in private unlisted companies in Africa. So these are high-risk investments. We wouldn't want somebody to put every penny they have into this. But this is a way of putting some of your money to use, getting a return of 8%, and having a really profound and staggering impact on the lives of some of the poorest people on the planet.
And just to clarify, currently just available to UK investors?
It is available to investors outside the UK, but everything we do is in sterling. So if you wanted to invest from outside the UK, you would need to have a sterling bank account, but provided you've got one of those, we're very, very happy for you to take part. We are not open to investors in the US and Canada, purely because the regulatory regime makes that pretty difficult, and we don't currently have pockets deep enough to get through all of those regulatory hurdles, maybe one day. But provided somebody has a UK bank account and wants to put their money to work in a really impactful way, then we'd love to see them on the platform.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on the podcast today, Ray. That was really interesting.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.